kind of more experiential aspect of the city. And I try to argue that what for me is really important is to start thinking not just, well, not that people have done it, but to really link the hard infrastructure of the city, the material environment, with the soft infrastructure. So everything that's between the built environment and people, how does that relationship get mediated through temporal relations, through the experiential realm, through the sensory, for example, as well. But also, guess what my work is really trying to do is to argue it's very political. The temporal is political, the sensory is political, and really start thinking about that in more detail. So while I was initially influenced by phenomenology, I also think that a problem for me with phenomenology is it doesn't politicize experience enough. And in today's times, and I think Barcelona is a perfect case study where the experience economy matters so much for the marketing of cities. It's really important to think about what's going on in our public realm in the cities in terms of how the experiential gets consciously managed, but also, of course, constantly subverted through everyday practices. So I would like to start the workshop then with a few reflections about time and the city. And you might disagree with me, and I think Marta might, but I think the city, Marta is our philosopher of the day. The city can be really argued as developing much more than nature, a series of human-inscribed temporal registers. And the making of urban space can be really understood as the materialization of time. And I think, when we look and walk around the urban, we can really see how the different regimes of power over the centuries are inscribed and reflected in the built environment, and how the social dynamics are also inscribed through the material practices in the city. So time is also central in the everyday life of the city, as it's structured through our rhythms of work, of institutions such as schools or churches, but also retail and leisure, how we relate to the city on an everyday basis. And then I also think that our embodied selves relate and access the city very differently through our different lifespans. And I guess earlier work of mine has really looked how everyday practices really influence how you access the city. So when you're a mother with a pram, you look at the built environment and at the public room very differently to a teenager or to an older person. So again, time is quite an important aspect in that kind of urban experience through the temporal self. However, most analysis of urban space and urban regeneration, especially in the disciplines I know, like geography and sociology, have tended to focus more on the impact of the restructuring of space. And they often only invoke time as almost a background feature. And Doreen Massey has famously argued that most disciplines have attempted to capture this passing of time within a spatial order. Yeah, so we always think of time through the spatial, but there's been very little analysis on the temporal itself in the city. Oh, okay, sorry. Do I necesito hablar con esto? Sí, okay. So this can be seen also in the way in which academic studies of regeneration projects have often a tendency, I think, to focus on very specific periods of time in urban development projects. And within the remaking of a neighborhood, and then they draw conclusions, and the paper gets published, and then it's there, static. Yeah, and there's very little longitudinal studies of long-term, analysis of how regeneration also gets embedded and digested locally after 10, 20, 30 years or longer. And I'm myself to blame for that. So basically, the fellowship then that I received from the British Academy allowed me to re-examine the materials I collected over the last 25 years on El Raval. I started in 1996 to really focus on the neighborhood. And I have realized that there are very different stories to be told when looking at the redevelopment of El Raval through the lens of time and the questions of temporality. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but I just want to share some of what I think are two key realizations, findings from this year. And one is that I think it's really necessary to start doing much more long-term analysis of urban transformation, but to show that urban regeneration is not just this linear chronological continuum that we're often the official story of progress that we often get, especially from the official bodies involved in regeneration, but that it gets, like I said, digested, reconfigured, and experienced over time through a diversity of temporal modes. And looking especially at the case study of the Rambla del Raval here really struck me that, you have very different temporal modes over the last 25 years that influence the construction, the experience, but also the settling of the Rambla del Raval. That can involve acceleration, waiting, stagnation, or expectation, to mention just some of the different temporal modes. So in my view, these temporal modes can support each other, but also collide. And studying especially El Raval, but the famous case study of the Rambla del Raval, where 5 housing blocks, 10,000 people got, relocated or dispersed, however you want to call it, from this space, really showed me that, while the official discourse was very much one of stagnation of El Raval, that we all heard, it was stuck in time, it needed to be redeveloped. You have that kind of official stagnation discourse, but then when you talk to the locals, what they mentioned much more was what I call a suspended temporality. Because there was a constant threat of demolition over years since the 1920s. It was much more of, we're waiting, nothing's happening. So a very different mode to many of the planners, etc., involved. And it's just, I think, really interesting to think about urban redevelopment when you look at these kind of different temporal qualities that different social groups express when looking, at a phenomenon. But also, another finding or thought I've had, and I've been influenced by Mike Racco, is he says that the ways in which timing of regeneration projects and their delivery happen really depend on very competing interests over time by developers, by planners, by local communities. That brings to light questions around how the tempos of neoliberal planning are constituted and what its temporal modes are. So, the questions are, when and why do regeneration projects accelerate or stagnate? What's the thinking behind, the tempo of a regeneration project? Whose times get prioritized in regeneration processes, both in the built environment and in the life of the neighborhood? And then what I guess I'm really interested in as well, how do locals experience the time frames of urban change? They can be either too fast, they suddenly happen, it gets announced, you need to leave your home within a year, or you have the constant threat, like the people of Raval said to me, some of the residents, the sword of Damocles hanging over you over 50 years, and nothing happens. And similar issues are happening at the moment in London with redevelopment projects, and how does that affect the attachments of people living within these areas? And Nuria Benach actually